Alright guys, welcome back. This is part 3 of the How to Fly Your NGX tutorial series that I am doing, and this will cover the descent planning, descent preparation, the descent itself, the arrival, the approach, the landing, and then shutting down the aircraft. So you can see, here on the ND, you can see top of descent is indicated just about 45 miles out. So we can go ahead and get started preparing our descent. First things first, you're going to want to reset your MCP altitude. Even if you cross over this top of descent marker, if your MCP altitude is set, it's a hard restriction, so we're going to stay at 240 unless we set this down. So we're going to set this down. You'll set this down based on whatever you're given by ATC, or if you don't have ATC, you can set it based on your charts. I will elaborate on the chart in a minute, but for right now I'm going to set this down to 17,000 feet. Next thing you're going to want to do is come up to your pressurization panel. I mentioned this when we were on the ground in part 2, and you're going to set your landing altitude. Now the altitude at Los Angeles, you can easily find this on SkyVector, this surveyed elevation of the field, is about 150 feet, so we're going to set this to 150. Once you've done that, you want to set your ILS frequency and course based on the runway that you're landing on now. We're going to be taking the ILS runway 25 left. So if you're looking at the chart that I had in part 1 of the video, you'll see that the frequency is 109.9. And I've mentioned this several times. I'm expecting you have some basic knowledge of reading charts. If you don't, I'd recommend researching that, and I can always do a video. So 109.9, we'll set that, 109.9, and insert that into the active, and we'll do this on both sides so that the navigational frequencies are tuned to the ILS, 109.9. You'll then need to set your course knobs here on the MCP, and again, this is on the chart. The approach course for 25 left is 251, so we'll set this on both sides as well. This point, set an auto brake. You'll set an auto brake based on your landing speed and based on the length of the runway. 25 left is about 11,000 feet, so we can set an auto brake of 1. If you were on a shorter runway, you might want an auto brake of 2 or 3. You can set your minimums at this point. Now your minimums are located here. You can see you have a radio side and a baro side. If you'd want radio minimums, if you were doing like a category approach, there was really poor visibility. For the sake of this, since there's good viz, we're just going to set the standard barometric minimums. You need to have the runway in sight at this point. If you don't, you have to go missed. So the minimums here are 304 feet. So if you look down here on the PFD, as we wind this knob, you'll see right here baro is changing, and we'll wind this up to 304, and this will give us minimum callouts at 304 feet on the barometric altimeter. Once your minimums are set, you can go ahead and brief your approach, so let's do that. We'll come down to the FMS. We'll go to the legs page here, as we can see, and you're going to want to cross-check this with your chart. So we're on the Hector transition, we're already over that. We're then inbound to Dipso. We're just now over Dipso. Just looking at the chart and making sure that all these fixes match what's on the chart. We're then inbound to Graham, and we need to cross Graham at 280 knots in between 17,000 and flight level 210. This is auto-filled. This is correct. We're then inbound to Rust, then Habso, and we're going to be at or above 14,000 feet. That is correct. We're then inbound to River, and we're going to be between 12,000 and 14,000 feet. That is correct. Everything after River are simply fixes on the extended ILS, when we put in the River transition. You're often not going to have these. For this particular arrival, you do. However, River is the last fix on the published arrival. Often what you'll see after something like this, you'll see River, and then you'll see Vector. And that just means you're going to receive a vector at that point onto your approach course. Obviously, if you're on VATSIM, ATC will give that to you. If you're not, you will have to do that yourself, and that just means basically flying a heading in order to intercept the approach course. Because this particular ILS has a transition off of the arrival, we don't have that. We just have a bunch of fixes here that aren't a part of the arrival. They're simply a part of the transition onto the ILS. You generally won't have this. This is a unique circumstance. But you just see various altitude restrictions. Say for instance that this wasn't auto-filled and you needed to set something at Graham, you just put in if you needed to set this altitude between 17,000 and flight level 210, you'd put a slash, and then you'd put 17,000, and then you'd put flight level 210, and you'd insert that, and it would do exactly, it says invalid entry, that's not correct. It would do exactly what it's done for you here. It's going to give you a particular window to hit. Let's say 14,000 or above wasn't in there. You just do a slash 14,000, 14,000 or above A, and you'd insert that, and you can see it goes right in. So it's fairly straightforward. We just now hit our top of descent. You can see the plane decelerate, and the altitude will start to come down slowly. We're in VNAV path, so see, top of descent just recalculated actually, so we haven't started descending. I lied. Once we hit TD here, we will begin our way down. At any rate, that's how you put in these entries. It's the same as I showed you on the ground in part 2. If you have a particular speed, you put in 250 slash, and you'd insert this wherever you need it, if it wasn't already in there for you. The last thing we can do here is find our landing speed. So if you come to the progress page on the FMS, you'll see fuel quantity right here. This is our current fuel quantity. This is how much we have on board. And you'll then see a prediction at your destination, which is Los Angeles, and you'll see fuel there. So we're going to lose about 0.7 of 1,000 pounds. So if we come to init ref, we're going to need to adjust our gross weight. So that should say 139.1. You're taking off 0.7. So you're basically estimating how much fuel you're going to have, how much gross weight you're going to have when you arrive. So take off 0.7 to account for the burned fuel, and you'll see your VREF speeds here. We're landing with flaps 30. That's standard procedure in the 737-800. If you had a really steep approach path, you could use flaps 40. If it was really windy, you could use flaps 15. But as a rule of thumb, use flaps 30. Click that, put it in the scratch pad, and then insert it here, and that will that'll get you good to go. So at this point, we've initiated our descent. You can see the plane's coming down, speed's reduced, and you can see right here a little vertical navigation profile. That diamond is where you want to be. If that gets too high, the plane will level off in order to allow this diamond to catch back up. If you get too high, so the diamond gets too low, meaning you're above your profile, you'll need to catch back up. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can pull out some speed brake, and what that will do is it will reduce your speed, and subsequently will allow you to descend at a greater rate and hold the same speed, and you should catch back up. Ideally though, you'll keep that diamond smack dab in the middle, and the auto flight should do that itself, but this arrival is actually a little tricky, so you'll see we'll need to use some speed brake later on in order to keep our descent profile properly, basically to keep on that mark. Once you've initiated your descent, you can go ahead and check the altimeter. In this case, you'll look at whatever the METAR is for your arrival field, and at Los Angeles, the current altimeter is 2987. So you can just set this right here, 2987. Don't yet, you'll see it's down here, kind of on the standby, but it's not yet inserted. You still have 2992 standard pressure set. This is just kind of, holding in there, ready to be set. So when you click standard, it will automatically set 2987, which is the current setting at Los Angeles. And you'll want to do that again at your transition level, which in the US is flight level 180. As far as your altitude goes, again, if you're on VATSIM, they might give you specific altitudes to descend to. If you're on a star like this, you'll want to kind of over each fix set it down. So over Graham, you'll want to have it set for 17,000, since they don't want you to be any lower than 17,000 at Graham. Once you've crossed over Graham, you can look at your next altitude restriction and say, hey, it's at Habso, it's 14,000, 14,000, so after crossing Graham, you'll set your altitude to 14,000. After crossing Habso, you'll say, oh look, river between 12,000 and 14,000. Then you'll set your altitude down to 12,000. Lovin, you'll set it, after river, you'll set it down to 10,000, so on and so forth. You're always chasing your next altitude, essentially. So we're just coming up on 18,000 feet here. There it is, so we'll set our altimeter to the local setting, which is 29 or 87, and we're just now over grams, so we're going to set our altitude down to our next restriction, which is at HABSO, and it's 14,000, so we'll set 14,000 on the MCP. And you can actually see as we went over gram there, it caused it such that the vertical navigation profile kind of was thrown off and we're a bit above. It's quickly coming back, however. If it wasn't, you'd want to bring out some speed brake in order to catch back up to that. But you can see it's coming back up. We went into VNAV speed there for a moment. That says VNAV path now. Just prior it said VNAV speed, and that was because we weren't on our vertical navigation profile. We were too high. Now that it's caught back up, it's re-entered VNAV path, and it's going to track and hold that particular vertical navigation path. And you can see the aircraft here is, whoops, I did not mean to do that. You can see the aircraft is an LNAV, so it's just following each of these fixes here. Fix to fix to fix. If we were in heading select, it would be holding whatever commanded heading we had here, whatever selected heading we had on the MCP. But that's not currently what we're in. We're in LNAV, we're on an RNAV arrival here with various fixes, so it's just going to track fix to fix to fix as its lateral navigation. So we're coming up on 14,000. We're just about to cross over HABSO, so we can now take a look at our FMS here again. Say our next altitude restriction is between 12,000 and 14,000, so we can set it down to 12,000. And the plane will just continue to follow that descent path down. And the reason we do this, when we set this down, we aren't actually descending the plane ourselves. What we're doing is we're allowing the plane to descend. I mentioned earlier, whatever's in the MCP here is a hard restriction. The plane, even if it means getting above the vertical navigation path and losing its profile, it is going to level off at that altitude, and that goes for when it's climbing and when it's descending. If you're climbing and this is set to 16,000 feet, it's not going to go above it. If you're descending and this is set to 12,000 feet, it's not going to go below that. So you need to have this below, either to whatever is assigned by ATC, or below whatever altitude the plane wants to descend through on its vertical navigation profile in order to allow it to do that. Otherwise, again, that's a hard restriction there in the MCP. It's going to level off and stay at that altitude. So there goes another ding. You can see we're about to hit 12,000. We're just about to hit river, so we'll look, see our next altitude restrictions 10,000 or above, so we'll set 10,000 feet. And you just continue to do this and monitor your speed and altitude. You can see we're right on profile, but our speed's a little high, and the FMS is actually telling us drag required. This is totally expected, so what you'll do is you'll just slowly bring out the speed brake, and that'll help to bleed off a bit of speed. You can bring this out all the way to flight detent. And the speed's coming down nicely, and you can see we're actually approaching, right? We're approaching 10,000 feet. So what the plane is going to do is it's going to decelerate down to 250 knots. As I mentioned earlier in part 2, the speed limit below 10,000 feet is 250 knots or lower. So you need to be at or below 250 knots, and the plane is going to attempt to achieve that. Now, if you're a little above that, especially as you're initially approaching 10K, that's totally fine, don't worry about it, but we'll bring out our speed brake all the way here just to get that altitude down. And given that we're approaching 10,000 feet and we'll be landing soon, you're going to want to turn your belts on if you haven't already, so that the passengers are sat down. We're just about to be over Lovin here at 10,000, and you can see at Crane, the altitude restriction is exactly the same, so we're just going to leave it at 10,000 here. We don't need to adjust the MCP altitude quite yet. speed is perfect, altitude is perfect, we're in great shape. Now as you're approaching crane here, you can go ahead and set your altitude again. Again, just check your next altitude restriction and set it down, 9,000 feet. And now that the throttles are spooling back up, we don't need our speed brake any longer, so we can begin to stow this. Again, slowly coming off the speed brake, not making any, you don't want to just yank this thing out. That would be unsettling for your hypothetical virtual passengers. And now that we're below 10,000 feet, you can turn on your fixed landing lights. Again, below 10,000 feet, you always want your fixed landing lights on. That's kind of standard procedure. And you can see as we begin to descend, speed's rising again, so we'll actually pull open more speed brake here, help the plane decelerate. You're just going to have to be on and off this, on and off this. It's going to, come and go. We'll set our altitude down to 8,000 feet now. And again, just work that speed brake, keep your speed under 250. And kind of, just keep that speed brake out a little bit if you need to. Tinker with it, put it a little bit back in, put it a little bit out. And you can see just here, speed reduced to 209 knots. I don't want to do this. We're still about 30 miles from the field, so if that ever happens and you want to keep your speed up, you'll click this button here, Speed Intervene, and it will hold a selected speed. You got to be careful because sometimes this will take you out of VNAV path and put you into VNAV speed, but given that we don't want to decelerate to 210 knots this far from the field, we're going to click Speed Intervene and manually select a speed. We still stay in VNAV, it's still going to follow this vertical navigation profile, but, and I need to set my altitude down here, but it's going to hold this particular speed. And we're coming up on 7,000 feet, so we'll set ourselves down to 5,000. Once you're about 20 miles or so from the field, you'll want to, 15 to 20 miles, then you can reduce your speed down to 210 knots. We're still a little ways from that point, so we'll keep it at 240 for a short while longer. And as you can see down here, we're just slightly above our vertical navigation profile, but we have our speed brake out and that's slowly coming back in. If you look down here, you can see the localizer is alive. We're actually right on it. So you can come over here to your MCP and take VOR loc, and you can see the localizer is captured and you will track the localizer. So we're off of LNAV. We're no longer using LNAV and tracking the fixes in our FMS. We're tracking the localizer that's being detected by the navigation radios. And at this point, we're going to drop our speed down to 210 knots. And given that you're under 250 knots, you're below your maximum flaps 1 speed, so you can take flaps 1. And here you can see the glide slope is now alive. We're picking up the glide slope here. So, when you see the glide slope is alive and being detected, you can select approach. Speed's coming down nicely. We still have our speed brake out to assist with that. And we'll now drop our speed down to 180 knots. And the glide slope is now captured. Given that the glide slope is captured, we can select the Bravo Alpha pilot there, so that both are engaged. If you were performing an auto land, you'd have to do this. We're going to do that for good practice, and then we'll disconnect the autopilot as we're approaching the field. Given that we're descending through about 5,000 feet, we'll want to get our engine start switches to continuous, just to make sure the engines continue to fire, especially this low to the ground. And now that our glide slope has been captured, we can set our missed approach altitude, which just from looking at the chart, we can determine it's 2,000 feet. Speed is dropping through 210 knots, so we'll take flaps 5. You can see just here the runway is about 15 miles out. Once we're over Honda here, so in terms of dropping the gear, the rule of thumb is you want to drop your gear about 10 miles from the runway, 10 miles from the field. So just as we're over Honda here, we're just about 10 miles out, we'll take gear down, and you'll then want to set flaps 15. So speed checked, flaps 15. You can see we're just below our flap reduction speed there, and we'll put the speed brake away since it's still out, and we will then arm it and bring our speed down to 172 knots. You can see the speed's dropping very nicely. We're right on our glide slope, right on the localizer. We're in really good shape. And then, again, another rule of thumb, about 5 miles from the field, and there's the radio altimeter, about 5 miles from the field or over your last fix, you'll reduce down to final approach speed. Given that the radio altimeter is alive, we're going to turn on all of our lights here in preparation for landing. You don't need to have the taxi light on here, but I like to have it on. Again, lighting is largely at the pilot's discretion. And at this point, we'll reduce down to our final approach speed. Now, you're going to need to have looked in your FMS in order to determine that. Ours is 146 knots. And then you'll want to check the winds in order to account for the winds. And the current winds at Los Angeles are 5 knots, so 146 plus 5 is 151. So we'll set 151 there on the MCP altitude, or MCP speed, and we'll take flaps 30. So we have our landing flaps 30 out, we have our go-around altitude set. The engine starters are set to continuous, our speed brake is armed, our gear is down, all of our lights are on. And at this point we are fully configured to land, so I can just now see the runway in sight. If you wanted to perform an auto land, you could, but I'd recommend getting used to flying the aircraft. So at this point I'm going to take out the autopilot, hand fly it down, and when you take out the autopilot, you can, if you have the runway in sight, which we do, you can take out your flight directors as well as your auto throttle if you want to manually handle your throttle. So autopilot's out, auto throttle and flight directors out, and we will hand fly it. So you can see we're just occasionally glancing down at that glide slope, mostly doing it visually. If you start to get a little low, you can just tip that nose up and put in a bit more throttle. But the most important thing is that you have visual contact with the field. There are our minimums callouts. We're landing.
100. 50, 40, 30, 20,
And we're down. Reverse thrusters are out and are green. Decel. At 80 knots, you can stow your reversers. And then at about 60 knots, you can begin manually braking. And we'll take this next exit up here on the right. And we are vacated the runway. Once you're out of the runway, you'll want to put your speed brake away. You can bring your flaps in. You can continue taxiing, turn off your auto brake, turn off your weather radar. You can stop your clock if you'd like. It was a 42-minute flight. You can turn off your data and terrain that you turned on the FO side and get rid of your traffic on the ND. Set your engine start switches back to off, turn off your strobe light, turn off your landing lights and your turn-offs. Turn on your APU. You'll want to set your transponder. If you're in Europe, set it to standby. If you're in the US, keep it in that middle, 2 clicks in the middle there, so it's still on mode Charlie. So, make sure that your lights are off, which they are, that your auto brake's off, that your speed brake and your flaps are stowed, your transponder set, that the APU's been started, that your clock's off, that your flight directors are off, and get, weather radar, weather radar, terrain data, etc., etc. Get all that off. And then taxi into your gate of choice. In our case, it is 47 Alpha, so I'm going to take a look at a ground chart, and I can actually see it right there. So we will taxi straight ahead to Terminal 4, and the gate is 47 Alpha, which is just up here. And then once we're parked up on the gate, we'll shut the aircraft down and wrap it up. As a rule of thumb, you want to taxi below 20 knots, and through turns you want to keep it below 10 knots. You can, kind of break that rule of thumb as you see fit. I understand that that's fairly slow speeds. You might be in a rush to, get off the ground. It's just a rule of thumb. Once you're off an active taxiway, you can, even if you're in the US, set your transponder to standby and turn off your taxi light so you don't blind the marshaller. Park up, you'll set your parking brake. Your APU should be running, so you'll transfer power here onto the APU generators, and that allows you to turn off the engines. Once the engines are off, you can turn your APU bleed on, obviously since the APU is running. Turn off your anti-collision light, turn off the belts. You can get rid of all your fuel pumps with the exception of the number 1 forward pump so the APU can run. You'll turn off your yaw damper. Turn off your electric hydraulic pumps, probe heat, window heat. Your packs can go to off, your isolation valve can go back to open, and you'll then want to come down into your FS actions here, go to ground connections, set your chocks, connect ground power, connect your air conditioning unit, pitot covers. You can kind of do this as you wish, and then you can open up doors if you want, so you can deboard with GSX if you wish. That's entirely up to you. Back up to the overhead, connect ground power. You can now turn off the APU and turn off this number 1 forward fuel pump here, since the APU is no longer running. And then you can run GSX, deboard, whatever you wish. So, that is the end of the NGX tutorial series, the end of part 3. So we've covered everything from pre-flight planning to to setting the aircraft up from cold and dark, getting it off the ground, and departure, and then the arrival. I really hope this tutorial, this series, was helpful to you guys. If it wasn't, I'm sorry to hear that. There are plenty of other great tutorials out there. I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents. There's nothing official about this. These are not official checklists. This is my way of doing it that I've kind of picked up on over many months, and it works for me. I hope it works for you. I hope you've learned something from this. If you have any questions whatsoever as to anything mentioned in this video, you're more than welcome to ask. That's a huge part of learning, is asking questions, so ask away. As I said, I might do certain videos on specific things mentioned in here, like deciphering charts, reading a METAR, using PFPX. I might go a bit more in-depth on those topics, but as always, thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you got something from this. Ask questions if you have them, and I will see you all next time. So long.